I am very pleased to be the moderator of this panel with four of my friends who we've all been working really for the last several months on this issue of big data and civil rights, and in fact have done a number of talks and discussions and meetings, and have really had a chance to kind of bond a little bit. So I'm really excited to introduce these friends of mine to my friends here in the privacy community, because I feel like, and the genesis for these principles was that there is just a tremendous amount of overlap in the needs and harms and interests of the civil rights community and the privacy community. And I'm at the ACLU, and so I'm somewhat uniquely situated to see that overlap, because we of course do both civil rights issues and privacy issues. So this is going to be, we're not going to do the talking head like everybody talks for 7 minutes. I'm going to try to keep it conversational and ask questions and just give us a chance to talk, and there will be time for questions at the end, and unless we just get really into ourselves, and then but hopefully we'll leave you time to ask a few questions at the end. So before we get too far down the road, I was hoping everybody could just introduce themselves very briefly and introduce your organization, and maybe talk a little bit about what you do, because I know that the civil rights space isn't as familiar for folks as some of the privacy work is. So I am Chris Calabrese. I'm a privacy lobbyist for the American Civil Liberties Union, and you guys are mostly familiar with what we do.
Hi everyone, I'm Corrine with the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. We are a coalition of more than 200 organizations representing every constituency probably in the United States, including the ACLU and the National Urban League and Advancing Justice, Asians American Advancing Justice, AAJC, are all Leadership Conference members. We're a multi-issue organization, but we care deeply about privacy and technology and data, and also, now that Chris is, I keep telling him this, I'm in Chris's world now, which is a very scary place, but fortunately we have good support systems there.
And good afternoon, my name is Hazeen Ashby, and I'm with the National Urban League. We are a 104-year-old civil rights organization. Our mission is to secure self-reliance, economic parity for African Americans and other underserved urban residents. We work on, like Corrine, we work on multiple issues, but our 4 empowerment goals are in housing, education, jobs, and health. And as we go through, I'll let you know why we think this is important, because data actually affects all those areas.
Hi, my name is David Robinson, and I'm part of a small group of technologists based in Washington, D.C. called Robinson & You, and we are a advisory firm that works with public interest organizations to provide computer science expertise. So I'm originally trained as a lawyer. My co-founder has a PhD in computer science, and we've been enormously fortunate and privileged to be a part of this coming together of these communities, and to be involved as technical advisors on this ongoing conversation.
Hi everybody. Sorry. My name is Jason Lagria, and I'm a senior staff attorney at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. We are a national civil rights organization with affiliates also in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Chicago. And our mission is to advance the civil and human rights of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders through building a fair and equitable society.
Do we actually have a panel of all of them?
Yeah, we consider David to be a technical expert. That's we're not pretending he's not an attorney. So I think probably the easiest place to start is, I'll give you 2 seconds of background. From my perspective, from my vantage point, one of the things that infuriates me as a privacy activist is when people say, well, where's the harm? Like, who's really getting hurt by these things? And I say, well, there's lots of harms. I mean, we talk about the harms of surveillance generally, but there's also a lot of specific harms that come when data is misused, that are real people who, there may be discriminatory data collection, there may be, the result of that may be that people are injured in a wide variety of ways. And so we began a civil rights discussion about, well, what do those harms look like in a civil rights context? And they're not all harms. It was a broader discussion about data. But one of the things that became clear was that there was a lot of common interest in terms of principles that we thought probably overlapped pretty well between what our traditional civil rights work, but also kind of very, very much privacy work. So, Corrine, do you want to just kick us off just by describing the principles? And there are printouts of these principles in the back on the chair back there, and you can also find them at the Leadership Conference's website, and that'll give you a good excuse to go to the Leadership Conference's website and check it out.
Wow, you just made our communications people really happy with that plug. Our website is www.civilrights.org, and as Chris mentioned, you can find the principles there. So I just wanted to start by saying that the values that underlie the principles are civil rights values of equal opportunity, of fairness, of justice, and these were values that we thought were missing from the current debate, and so we decided to inject them into the debate through our civil rights principles for the era of big data. And I just wanted to say that for those people, and there were many of them who wondered why civil rights groups cared about big data or why big data was a civil rights issue, the reality is that civil rights organizations have cared about data for a very, very long time. A top priority for the Leadership Conference and our member organizations is the census, and that's because census data is used to document who we are as the American people. It's used to document racial and ethnic discrimination. It's used for federal programs. It's used for redistricting. So there are huge benefits to data, and big data just, in many respects, turbocharges both the benefits and the risks. So the principles are designed to address some of the major concerns that the civil rights community sees when it comes to big data. The first principle is stop high-tech profiling. Somewhat self-evident as to where we're going with that. It's not that we support low-tech profiling. It is that high-tech profiling, big data makes possible racial profiling in ways much deeper, much broader than heretofore possible, and we'll talk in more specifics about what that means. The second principle is ensure fairness in automated decisions. Again, it's somewhat self-evident, but with computerized decision-making in areas of such areas as employment, as credit, for example, there are also opportunities for discrimination, again, in ways that may not be immediately evident to the person who's being affected. The third principle is preserve constitutional principles. We support the Constitution. And the fourth principle is enhance individual control of personal information. It's probably a principle that is most closest to the hearts of many people here. And the fifth one is protect people from inaccurate data, because, again, of decisions that maybe flow from the data, which may in turn be inaccurate or based on stereotypes. So these 5 principles summarize where we're coming from when it comes to issues of civil rights and big data, and I think that our conversation today is going to dig deeper a little bit to how we're coming at it, and it's not just civil rights groups. Now, of course, it is this issue has risen to the surface in ways that we are just delighted about, and has become part of the White House report on big data, and I know a lot of folks in this room have been thinking about these issues as well. So looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
And I think we'll touch a little bit on sort of where we're going with some of this stuff. But before we do that, I thought it would be helpful to just keep putting some meat on the bone and talk about specifics. Hazeen, would you mind, you've got some great examples of how information collection and employment, for example, can be misused in ways that aren't immediately obviously racial, but have serious racial impacts. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that and some of the other reasons that brought you to these principles?
So I guess I'll start with one of the biggest reasons we came we decided to really kind of delve into or dive more into the privacy sector right now. It's because one, we're a civil rights organization. Two, I think that everybody knows what happened in the 60s with COINTELPRO. So it's not something that it's not new for us in the way of we know what surveillance is like. We understand people collecting a lot of information about our communities and how the information can really affect us. What's happening now and why I think it's even more, it's pervasive and even more scary is that it's not transparent. So I think one of the biggest things, I think everybody in this room knows what a data broker is, correct? FTC, right? So one of the things that the data brokers sell the most are reports that are not necessarily credit reports, and they're not necessarily regulated underneath the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And these reports are used to determine people's eligibility for employment. They're also used for credit, even though people say that they're not, but they usually are. And in the employment area, it's really dangerous because we are currently still in a time period where African Americans have double the amount of unemployment as any other group. Our African American teens are unemployed at like 16 to 19 at the rate of like 37%. And then these decisions are being made without people knowing why they were dismissed from their job or why they never even received a call back from their job. There's information being asked when you take some of the tests. Some companies are using services that are finding out how far you have to travel to your job. So it's asking you how long your commute is, what type of vehicle or transit system you use to get to your job. Now, that's not inherently racist, but we do know that there's redlining. So this is almost creating a new digital redlining. Because if you look at what's been happening in the last, I think, decades actually, the last 20 years or so, the recession kind of stopped it a little bit. And there was a report about this last year in April that showed that jobs, especially in urban areas, were moving out to the suburbs. So it's called job sprawl. It's going out to the suburbs, which means that people who are low income can't really get to those jobs easily. And they sometimes have to commute more than 45 minutes to an hour to get to that job. And even if it is, and it's something I think we're going to get on later, even if it's accurate to say that people who have to travel a long period of time to get to work may not stay in your job for a long period of time after that, is it fair that if you have to travel more than 45 minutes to an hour because you don't have the money to live in the suburbs, or somewhere near where jobs are, that you shouldn't be allowed to have that job? And I'll stop. I had so many, but I guess I'll keep jumping in. I don't want to bore everybody with all of them.
Yeah, and I think that's just a wonderful example because it's not intuitively obvious unless you understand that, people in the inner city may have to travel further, that piece of data is actually racialized in a way that it was not intuitively obvious, at least to me. So to keep doing this, Jason, do you want to just give another sort of concrete example about some of the government database and collection and issues?
Sure. So I guess to start a little bit of background, I represent a lot of the interests of the Asian American community, and many people in our community are actually foreign-born. So about 60% of the community is born outside of the country. 1 out of 3 Asian Americans actually don't speak English very well too. So in this backdrop of high limited English proficiency and foreign-born population, we've run into an issue with the E-Verify program, which is a government-run database where anyone who's trying to get employed, they get their name run through the system, and they get like a ping back saying yes, you're authorized to work in this country, or you're not allowed to be authorized to work in this country. And there's a false positive rate, and it's pretty low. But what we've seen with the Asian American community, that it's 30 times more likely if you're a naturalized citizen. So if you immigrated here from another country and became a citizen, you're 30 times more likely to be flagged with the false positive. If you're a high-skilled worker, for example, and there are a lot of Asian Americans in these fields, and they're coming over for skilled worker visas, they're 50 times more likely to get flagged for a false positive. And why is this? Part of it is because just the inherency of databases. There are going to be errors. You look at like first and last names. Sometimes people get confused with Asian names because sometimes they're reversed. Sometimes the names are just foreign sounding. Just let's be honest here. To a typical American, they might not get how to spell a name. Even if their last name has an extra space added to it, that could get a false positive for you. On top of that, what we've seen that employers have done is once they have this data, they could actually intimidate their employers, saying, hey, you better listen or go along with us or we're going to run E-Verify. We've also seen employers not tell people. When people apply for the job, they run it, and they get the false positive. You're supposed to tell the potential employee, but they don't. Again, people just aren't even hearing about that this inaccurate data is being used against them. Finally, at least in the government aspect, there's a way to address it and correct it, but that takes time and that takes money. And imagine if you're, low income, you're working 2 jobs, you got to take time off, maybe even hire a lawyer just to get this fixed. And on top of that, just think about it if you don't speak English very well. Luckily, the government has a lot of language access services, but again, just imagine that's in a government program. Now translate that to a completely private system with zero transparency and complete opacity, and you don't know when these what data they have about you, if it's accurate, who's taking actions against you based on that data. So again, that's just one of the examples we've seen.
Thanks, Jason. See, normally I like to keep it a little more fast and furious, but I feel like every time we have 2 microphones on at once, everybody goes, feedback. So if we're not as quippy as we normally would be, that's the reason why. David, do you want to keep our parade of horribles going by describing even more awful things that one can do with data that discriminate or potentially discriminate?
Well, so there are a number of areas where there's particular concern, other than the feedback on this microphone, which is concerning to me. One area that I think hasn't come up yet, but that is a common interest amongst the civil rights and the privacy community is local law enforcement. And in that area, one thing that we're starting to see is a growing use of what gets called predictive policing. And this is where you feed into a machine learning algorithm information about past, often it gets called historic crime statistics, but of course, these statistics are partly a record of where crimes happened, and they're partly a record of where police looked. And so, certain communities of color, communities that have lower average incomes, are places where police resources have historically been concentrated, and there are good reasons why, to some extent, policing resources are focused where there is, higher risk of violent crime and things of that nature. But on top of that, there's a sort of problem of a statistical echo chamber effect, where minor infractions are much more likely to be detected, documented, acted upon by law enforcement in some communities than in others, which just creates this exaggerated sense of how different the circumstances are between the communities. And it's very hard once you encode something quantitatively, once you feed it to an algorithm, once the computer spits out some guidance about where to put new enforcement resources, it's very hard to go back and untangle that and say, hey, wait a minute, maybe the reason that, we're telling you to focus on this community is that this is a place where police have historically chosen to pay more attention, and it's sort of a, quantitative version of rounding up the usual suspects. And it's, often the fact that there's a computer in the middle of a process sort of acts like anesthesia for people in terms of their moral intuitions, it came from a computer, it must be neutral, it must be fine. But of course, that's not the case. And then just sort of lastly, on the local law enforcement piece, and this extends, of course, also to federal law enforcement, there's a real concern about the new surveillance tools that are at the disposal of law enforcement and the lack of controls on those tools, things like automatic license plate readers, things like facial recognition scanners, which are handheld, which police now are increasingly rolling out. These technologies arrive without clear limits on how they can be used often, and they often are deployed without audit controls that would make it possible to go back and examine how is this technology being deployed and how are the operators choosing to focus their attentions. And those are gaps. Those are some of these systems, they're closed to scrutiny, but they're open to abuse, and so I think it's a concern.
And we could go on and on and on. I mean, there's a real, I mean, if you think the terrorist watch list is deployed without any regard to religion, you are incorrect. If you think that no police officer has ever looked at a social network in order to determine if they should arrest someone, and if that is in turn skewed by race, you'd be incorrect. Even the NSA feeding the DEA drug surveillance information. I mean, the way that this is interwoven is stuff that we could really talk about a lot. The use of information in a sort of that bypasses the Fair Credit Reporting Act, but has real potential implications for what financial offers people get. I mean, there's just we tried to give you a flavor so folks can kind of get a sense about the universe, but I think that we are, even as we uncover this, still like coming up with more and more stuff as we begin to look at things through this lens. So, but I don't want to fill the whole hour with that, because I think that you guys are creative and smart people, and you can probably find some of these harms on your own, and I encourage you to look at these harms through that lens going forward. But one of the things that we frequently get asked is, okay, you've rolled out these principles. They've been enormously successful, right? I thought they were very successful. But they've been featured in this White House report. They're being discussed at, in policy roundtables across DC. Where would you go? Where do you want to go with this? What do you want to do? And I think, in all candor, that's a question we are just starting to answer ourselves. But Corrine, would you like to talk a little bit about what at least we have done and where we might go?
So the easy answer would have been, we start out with a goal of trying to influence the debate, and we found ourselves cited over and over again in the White House report. So, we can go home now because our work is done. But so it is, I think there's a level of public education that needs to be undertaken with respect to the intersection of civil rights, privacy, technology, big data, which is, we're in the beginning stages of doing. And I think there are a lot of sectors who are very interested in engaging in this public education endeavor. So whether it's the technology sector, whether it's grassroots advocates, whether it's people in DC, policymakers, I think it's an exciting time. We've talked about how we feel like this is the moment where we can really try to shape some rules of the road that will help help us navigate through this new frontier. And while many of the issues that we've been talking about, in the traditional offline world, are issues that we've known for a very, very long time. As I mentioned before, big data has the ability to turbocharge these issues. So I think we're in the process of helping our own communities understand the benefits and the downsides of big data. We're trying to figure out, are there areas where there are gaps in the law? I think the answer is yes, but we have to figure out, how do we want to fill those gaps? And and again, bearing in mind that our groups are based in Washington, D.C., what does that mean when we have to deal with Congress that is having a very tough time getting, laws passed, and in an administration that is, facing that kind of resistance. So, and is, I think, struggling with these questions on its own. So, it's a difficult political environment, but I do think that there are, as I said, seems to be the moment where there are some opportunities to really make a difference. And I'll say, as civil rights advocates, we are prepared to bring that expertise to this debate. As scary as the world of Chris Calabrese is, and your world, for civil rights advocates, these are the issue of discrimination is something that has been around for a very, very long time and will continue for the foreseeable future, we think. But we have been very successful as civil rights advocates in having rules of the road put in place so that certain types of discrimination are unlawful. So that's the kind of expertise that we can bring to the debate in terms of issue spotting and helping to identify solutions moving forward. So as an immediate next step, lots of public education, lots of thinking, lots of connecting with thought leaders in all the different spaces to try to figure out, how to navigate the new frontier.
And I would say that, first, before I even piggyback on what Corrine said, I also want to really make it clear that as a panel of almost all attorneys, I think we're all attorneys here, and as civil rights workers, we understand and actually like data. That's how we were able to show discrimination in many of our cases, is because of data. So when we sit up here and we say that there are horrible things happening with data, it's not saying that technology is bad or data is horrible. Now, first of all, I wouldn't have made it out here to see you guys if I didn't have Google Maps. And because I am horribly, and as the people who drove up here with me know, because I can barely tell my left and my right sometimes, or often, I would not have been able to traverse here if I had to read a map. One, that is something that went out a long time ago, and I don't think there are paper maps anywhere. I feel bad for Ray McNally, but yes. So I want people to understand we like data. And so I can piggyback from that and say, I actually think that where we're at right now is being able to work with people like you, who are activists, who are hackers, who know how technology how technology works to help us find, and this is going to be interesting, the data that we can create a real, true public education program around. While we're sitting here and we know that there are things happening, we know that if one of the credit bureaus, Equifax, has over 75,000 bits of data on you from when my last OBGYN visit was, what types of shampoo I use, where I live, the last time was I bought something. I'm not even going to get into all the gender issues, because I know that my boss, if I go to apply for a job, you can't ask me, because it's against the law, are you planning to get pregnant? But I know that if you've gotten this information from Equifax and it tells you that I've gone to the OBGYN 6 times in the last couple of months, you might think, hey, she's of childbearing age, she might be pregnant. You wouldn't even have to ask me that anymore. So we still live in a world where women, we make 77 cents to a man's dollar. There are real issues here. But because it's such an opaque system, we need people to be able to help us get that information to know when discrimination is occurring. So I'll give another personal example, right? A couple weeks ago, I went to buy a car. I'm still working with the FTC and Better Business Bureau right now to figure out how this happened. But I have a really great credit score, actually. I'm quite proud of it. I've worked really hard for it. My parents instilled that. I have a great credit score. I was surprised as heck. I walked in and they were like, with a check already to give them for my credit union. And they were like, we can get you like a 0.9% interest rate if you go with our bank. I was like, okay, that's not bad. I'll do that. I didn't get the loan because one credit bureau had that I had a fraud alert on my credit report. Not all 3, like it's supposed to be by law. Because once you put it on by one, it then transfers to the other 2 so that you don't have to call each one of them to do it. One of them had it. I don't know who put it on. I don't know why it was put on. I don't know when it was put on. All I know is that my cell phone number that I've had for over a decade was not attached to it, and I cannot get it off. Absolutely cannot get it off. Now, because I do this for a living now, I've gone to the FTC and filed my report. I've gone to the Better Business Bureau and did my report. This is over a month ago. I still have not gotten any sort of resolution. This is something that I'm dealing with, being somebody who's a lawyer who works on telecoms issues, and I can't take care of it. I can't figure out how to ameliorate it. What's going to happen to the common American?
This is a great segue to like what regulators might do with existing authority. David, there was a data broker report that the FTC published last week. I think it was last week or 2 weeks ago that talked about some of the challenges and the potential complexities of regulating data brokers. But I was wondering if you might want to weigh in a little bit on how they could use existing authority and what, how do we push for things? I mean, what Hazeen is talking about, of course, is regulated by the Fair Credit Reporting Act, right? I mean, it's quintessential Fair Credit Reporting Act situation, which just demonstrates the continuing problems even with a regulated space. But I don't know, do you want to talk a little bit about pushing some of, seeing, given our poor track record of getting laws passed, what we might see in terms of a regulator space for, pushing some of this stuff?
Sure, and I guess maybe one of the first things to underline is that I suspect that for many in this room, the Fair Credit Reporting Act might be new territory. But this is maybe to underline that there are opportunities for policy impact here that combine these areas. That is to say, you might have thought we were just thinking about ECPA and communications privacy, but these same set of concerns around who's got the data, how can they get it and when, and how are they using it and when, now it turns out are central questions in the consumer credit marketplace. And I think, partly what that means in terms of existing law. So the Fair Credit Reporting Act governs not only eligibility decisions for credit, like the one that Hazeen had, but it also governs things like job-related decisions. That when you're using information for an eligibility purpose, there are certain things you're supposed to do, like notify of an adverse decision, like give people the chance to obtain and to correct data about them that might have led to an incorrect decision about them. But in practice, for some of these other uses outside of credit, it's much harder for the person to know who might be affected that an adverse decision has been reached. Like if, for example, someone is screening through an out-of-date database of arrest or conviction records, that may, maybe something was expunged, or maybe it's an arrest that didn't lead to any further action. But it might still be in there, and they might be using it for the purpose of deciding that they don't want to interview you for a job, and that might be, in fact, be covered by the letter of FCRA, but you're never going to know that happened if you're the person who applies for the job.
But you don't even have to use FCRA at that point, because one of the places that people are getting information from, the data brokers are actually pulling information, are from public records or even newspaper articles. So if you're collecting that data and yours is great. If they're collecting that data and they're pulling it from newspaper articles, right? So let's say you're 16 and you did something bad, and say you started a fire. Well, maybe not a fire because those are actually, but still. Say you started a fire, but as you got older and you did your community service, it was expunged. But that was actually recorded, and they reported it in your local paper. Because people are pulling information from newspaper articles that are online, that can follow you for the rest of your life, even if it was expunged. So is anything ever truly expunged? We know what the internet is now. So if you can go back and you can pull stuff from public records, and I know that a lot of people in this room probably believe in the efficiency of the government, and I know that the government works really hard to always make sure that they have correct data at every single point, knows that just maybe sometimes you might get something that was wrong.
So I realize to Chris's question about regulatory intervention,
You don't have to answer my questions. It's okay. You can just say what you want.
One interesting area that's that's an area that's hot right now and important structurally is what is the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, doing with its new authority, and in particular, its new authority that is supervisory, that is the ability to peel back the curtain and find out what's happening in the undisclosed practices of covered financial entities with respect to, in particular, fair lending. And one of the laws that the CFPB checks for compliance with is the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And in fact, in the CFPB's opinion, and I would hasten to add in the civil rights community's opinion, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act allows for what are called disparate impact claims, which means that even if there was no biased decision maker, even if we're talking about a computer algorithm, the law still requires that it not have a disproportionate adverse effect on protected groups, including racial minorities, women, and other groups. And the question of how do you audit an algorithm for its compliance with, these fair lending requirements? How do you make sure that it's not accidentally unfairly disadvantaging an already disadvantaged group? Is a question that no one has sharp answers to at this point, but the CFPB has a structural opportunity to go in there and look at that. And I guess I just wanted to maybe add that to people's list of sort of next steps that are being thought about is what does it mean technologically to implement some of these searches for discrimination and to remedy these things? And I think there's an opening here to work with technologists, and this is something that I think you're likely to see the civil rights community beginning to do, is to say, okay, how do we detect it? And also there's an opportunity here for creativity about how do you remedy? Can we use these same powerful systems? Can we use this data not only to find where the problems exist, but can we use it to address the problems that exist, to ensure that people are given that access to opportunity, that our sense of fairness and our legal and moral principles tell us that they ought to have. And I think that that's a frontier where there's tons of room for improvement and development, is how do we take our values and encode them into these systems.
So we've been going around and talking to a lot of different policymakers about these questions. We've talked to people at the FTC, we've talked to people at DOJ, we've talked to the White House, we've talked to a lot of people. So Jason, you've been in a lot of these meetings. You've heard, you've heard our spiel about 1 million times, but you've heard like various responses. Do you want to give people a sense about like what are we hearing from policymakers? Like what kind of like responses are we getting? Just sort of a little bit of an inside the peel away the curtain a little bit, look at like what folks are kind of saying back to us.
I've been at a lot of FTC meetings, and it's a typical government response. Their hands are tied, and it is probably true. A lot of their jurisdiction and powers are set out by Congress or limited by Congress, so they're waiting on Congress to expand their powers, for example. At our meeting with the DOJ, which probably off the record, and this is on the internet, but
Don't be too specific.
It's the bureaucracy that they deal with. Even when there's a White House big data report that says these are things that need to be done, money needs to be allocated to do that, and that's a whole other separate thing. Then there's a realignment and getting people with the right technological skills on board too, and again that just takes time, and you got to turn the wheels, and definitely I've heard a lot of that, and for us that maybe we're used to it because we've been doing this for years now, and we know that change is slow but will eventually come, hopefully. But that's a lot of what I've heard.
I think that's fair. My personal favorite was a person in government who will remain unnamed said, well, that report came out, that report came out 6 weeks ago. That's like yesterday in bureaucracy time, or maybe even today. So, it's not speedy. But Hazeen, you wanted to weigh in.
Yeah, well, I was going to say it's because of that, because we know everything's really slow moving, and we don't really have that luxury of taking everything as like at Washington speed, what is currently Washington speed. That's why I was really excited to come here today, because I knew that there are people in the audience who could probably already do this stuff for us and start getting the information out. Like, I'm not advocating what Edward Snowden did, but I think that there's a lot of stuff that was still been in the dark if we didn't have a private actor who found that there were issues that were against that violated our constitutional principles, and then made it public, and the government had no recourse but to react. So as I was reading, and we've talked about this conference, I know that there are people here who do that, you guys have thought about privacy for a long time. You probably have thought about ways that I haven't even thought about it. Like for my example, right? Start looking at if there's a way, an algorithm that can be written to look at how much more often are fraud alerts being used, and in what instances are people being denied credit, and have we seen a surge in that since the recession? And have those people who've been denied credit, are they of a particular race? Because of course we're going to have enough data on everybody to be able to tell what race you are, even if you don't ask me straight out, are you African American? I bet you if you know the hair products I use, you're going to guess that I'm African American.
I like the way you stood up and previewed my desire to get questions from the audience. Thank you. Boy, this is... So I'll go like this. I'll stand further back. So if you could just sort of identify yourself and ask a really awesome, interesting question. We will endeavor to either answer it or dodge it, depending on what you're asking. Please go ahead.
So my name's Kalia. My handle online is Identity Woman, and I have this. One of my jobs is I'm an unconference facilitator, so I keep wanting to make a sticky map of everybody who's here and which government things they're most active with, and then network it all together. But apparently we don't have time to do that. Maybe it's an evening activity. Because I'm struck by sort of some of the themes that I'm hearing here, and an effort that I'm engaged with, which is the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, another slow-moving government process. It's in year 3, and so far it's only me and the AARP and patient privacy rights showing up to advocate for users. And it's a multi-stakeholder process that will become government policy. So it's interesting, there's one arm which is pushing the government, and then they open up these stakeholder processes, and then industry floods the room, and civil society's no, we just can only do reactive things and not slower things. So I'm curious, how do we as a movement of interested technologists, hybrid people like me who live in both worlds, and lawyers actually understand the map of what's going on, and how do we put the pieces together and be the most effective? Because I think, I brought actually this Bill of Rights to the effort, saying unless you improve your diversity, this group of civil rights and big data people is going to not like your answers at the end. But in the meantime, it continues with industry leading the way and government kind of nodding. So how do we actually change the game and be more strategic as a whole, is my question.
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I almost feel like I at least have multi-stakeholder flu. It's making me sick because I feel like it's taking so much of my time. I'm not necessarily seeing results from it. I happen to be very involved in a different multi-stakeholder process right now. I won't even tell you which one it is. Some of you know. But it's it's really hard, and you feel like I could be doing this for a long time and I'm not necessarily getting anywhere. So I think that's part of the reason that I teed up the question about what can regulators do now, and how do we push our existing legal authority? Because it's if there's a creative legal hook, maybe that's a better way forward than to try to find a multi-stakeholder process that ends up consuming so much of our time but not necessarily resulting in a positive outcome. Other people want to take a shot at that?
I think one of the things that I asked when we went to the FTC was for them to expand their definition of data broker and also a credit report. Because as Kalia was just talking about the health stuff, most of your personal and sensitive health information is not covered under FCRA. So, and you don't actually have a right to get a lot of that if that's being collected about you. So yeah, there's a right, you have that personal right with HIPAA, nobody can disclose that information, but that information is actually not only being disclosed by your doctor. I mean, people are collecting every time you go buy so something interesting. Every time, like, say you go to CVS and you use your CVS number, your card, and you buy prescriptions, that's actually collecting what prescriptions you buy. If you buy a certain kinds of prescription, people are going to know what sorts of issues you have. And if you read the FTC report that just came out, that's why they have things like cholesterol focus, diabetes, because they know what you have just from what you're buying. But if you expand that definition, then these are things that will fall underneath either FCRA or fall underneath like what a data broker is. But right now, since it's self-regulated, I mean, and I just love self-regulated fields. I think they're just great. Understand? I hope you guys heard the sarcasm.
Another one?
Hi. My name is Emily Shaw, and I work for the Sunlight Foundation. I manage our state and local policy program. And so from that perspective, something that I'm interested in asking your group is whether you see the possibility for advancements on the state level that are obviously much more complicated to achieve at the federal level. If you look at states like California, which have been leaders in terms of achieving movement in online privacy, there's action there. There's a right to know law that was proposed that would allow people to access from commercial entities information about private information that was held. So I'm thinking about this primarily with reference to governments. Maybe we should think about a gray button that we could advocate for where people could access all their government information, not just their health information through a blue button. But what about supporting states that are already moving in the right direction?
I certainly have a feeling about this, but I don't want to. I think states may be our best ally in this effort. I mean, might be part of it may be a personal bias. I got my start in state government. I was a lawyer in the Massachusetts Senate many years ago. So I will say I think states can be more nimble. They can actually pass laws without spending decades chewing on them like Congress seems to. I will say that where states can sometimes need help is in figuring out precisely what the problem is and what the right policy solution is. So one of the things that I think I hope is that it won't just be policymakers, it'll also be researchers, it'll be academics, it'll be good allies in the federal regulatory space that will lift up some of the problems and talk about some of the solutions. Like who tells the difference between bad race data collection and good race data collection? You know what I mean? Like these are policy questions that need answers. And once we find some of them, I feel like bringing them out to the state space is a great way to potentially get some success. But I worry that we're not quite there yet. And I think if we start too early going to the states, the risk is that we will get, that void will be filled with policy solutions that may not actually solve the problem or could, be problematic in other ways.
So I made you go first because I thought I was going to disagree with you, and then you circled back, and so because it would just be fun. This is a post-lunch discussion, so it's always fun to debate Chris. I worry a little bit about a patchwork solution to some of the problems that we are identifying, and I think my own bias is that I do think the federal government has very important role to play in terms of the leverage that the feds can impose upon others. And so, they say that civil rights is for the long distance runner. I feel like we're at the very beginning stages of trying to figure out what the rules of the road may be. And, it's noteworthy that this is a big anniversary year as well. It's, the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act is the 60th anniversary of Brown v. Board. It's 25th anniversary of the World Wide Web. And it is, it's time to think about civil rights and big data, in those contexts, I think, in terms of, whatever we do now, 50 years from now, is people may be looking back through, the whatever camera behind their eyeball that, they will be looking back at this time and seeing the moment that exists. And as urgent as the problem seems to be, there's seems to me to be quite a little bit of research and thinking to figure out, you know, what exactly we want to have done. So again, I agree with Chris that I think the states have a very important role to play, but I do think we can't get ahead of ourselves in this issue.
So you get the last question.
Good news is it's very brief and it's not even a question. We've heard lots of great examples here of the kind of problems in the civil rights context that big data and particularly alternative types of scores can produce. I just wanted to call to people's attention in the unlikely event this crowd hadn't seen it, a study called The Scoring of America by the World Privacy Forum. My hair was not white before I read it, and having read it, you see the result. So if you want or need more examples of just how pervasive the kinds of problems, misuse or unregulated or unknowing applications of big data can produce, I do commend it to you. The Scoring of America, World Privacy Forum.
Yeah, it's a really good report. I think sometimes we don't spend enough time paying attention to the retail applications of what we are discussing, and to me, scoring is the perfect, like, I'm an employer, tell me whether I should hire this person. Green, yellow, red, go! Like, that's what you get. And it's, you know, it cannot take too much to dump you in the red category, and you may not figure out why or what the piece of data was. So it's a great example. David, wasn't there another good paper that we just got back? Were we? Is that not public yet? Am I? Never mind. There's no good paper that may come out in the future about this. Pay no attention to the moderator. All right. With that, I'm going to try to keep us on time because I know we have wonderful people who want to talk about other things at 2 o'clock, probably somewhere besides this room. You've been a great audience. Thank you very much. I think I can speak for everybody on this panel by saying that we hope this is the beginning of a discussion. So if anything we've said has been interesting to you and you want to talk about it more, or exchange business cards or keep in touch, we'll be standing up here, and we're really excited to keep doing this. Thank you.
Thanks.